So good day and welcome to our May 2024 SAL Structured Conversation. Before we start, we want to let you know that our session is being recorded and closed captioning is available. I am Julie Morrison. I'm the Assessment Director at Glendale Community College in Arizona. I am also a member of the SAL Professional Learning and Development Committee. And on behalf of our committee, I want to thank you for participating in today's structured conversation. I know you're all excited to be here. SAL and our committee are committed to involving, featuring, and representing diverse perspectives and identities in our offerings to meet your professional development needs. You can help us achieve this goal by submitting a structured conversation proposal of your own. More information can be found on our SAL structured conversation page. I'm going to drop the link into the chat in case you're going to be inspired to want to be a presenter coming up, or maybe you just have an idea you want us to talk through with you. During this presentation, we invite you to participate by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through the chat function. We will be monitoring chat and pulling items out of that for the Q&A time at the end. To get us started, if you haven't yet, please put your name and role and institution into the chat so our presenter can get a sense of who is in the audience today. Now, that was all the background, but we are now here for the main event. It's why you are all here today. So please join me in welcoming our presenter, Dan Bureau. Dan will introduce himself and share his thoughts on raising your standard, effectively implementing CAS standards for student affairs continuous improvement efforts. And it heads to you, Dan.
How do we use these standards? Why do we have to assess ourselves? What difference does it make? It takes a lot of time to do this, and I have a job to do. We went through the process, and now what? You can be more efficient. You need to prioritize. What is it that you're supposed to be doing? Why don't you just try some new things? My name is Dan Bureau. I am the Assistant Vice President for Student Health and Wellbeing at Louisiana State University, and I'm here today as in the assessment world as a past president for the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, commonly known as CAS. I served as the president from 19 to 21, and I'm currently on the governing board still as the member at large for assessment, research, and publications. I'm also a longtime member of SAL, and I'm grateful to be in the space with you all, knowing that this is a very busy era for you all as well. I will say, entering into preparation for this webinar, and many of you on the chat, I recognize some names. People know that I always try to bring my A game. I'm going to own today that I have so much stuff to do. I never thought it could get this busy era. And I am a parent to a 4 and a 9-year-old, and I will tell you that I have come to really embrace the Swiftie in me. And so I thought that I would introduce, but my own era right now is that of being overwhelmed and just kind of at the end of like the semester. So I want to own that today. Please give me some hearts and some thumbs up if you're kind of in that same place. I want to commiserate with you, but also know that there is a light at the end of that tunnel for all of us. We are getting to that place where we will get through this all. I'm also in it's 1 o'clock and I've only had a bagel and coffee era day. So I will also say that I'm going to do my best to stay focused on this. Conceptually, I had some different ideas going into this, but I do think that while maybe the aesthetics of the slides and those kind of things aren't quite where I'd want them, I hope you all bear with me as we think about different creative ways in order to implement the CAS standards. So let's just, and this is pretty typical, we've been to CAS sessions before. We always want to kind of gauge in the room kind of what your experience levels are. What I will say is that, this isn't perfect. I know this is a lot of assessment folks here. I would not necessarily go with this in terms of double barreling some items, but really what I want to get a sense of is to what extent you know about CAS and that you use them. So I'm going to look at the chat here. Please put in there kind of what you're thinking, where you are in terms of mindset right now. And using CAS, I see some 2s, 1s, 5s, 4s. I mean, all over the gamut. I will say that probably average here is somewhere between 2 and 3. And that's totally okay. What I will say is that there are some sessions that I've done in the past that are more 101 like, and there are some that are way more advanced. The distinctive function of this webinar today for me was in order to help people think creatively about infusing CAS into culture. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the basics of the CAS standards. There are some resources I can share after the fact. People can reach out to me. There are other webinars that have been recorded through SAL and on the CAS website that focus on that 101 of CAS, and also ones that focus more in depth around the implementation of self-study and program review. But just know that today is really about some of these outcomes right here. I'm really drawn to this idea about continuous improvement in terms of reframing the terminology of assessment. I think we would benefit ourselves to stop using assessment and look more at this idea of continuous improvement, only because people default so often to the methodologies around the assessment practice versus the idea that we're going to do this for improvement purposes. So I'm really kind of thinking about how CAS how you can use these beyond self-assessment and program review. My thoughts are kind of organized about this, but if you know me also, I can just go on a tangent and start talking about kind of how this might look. So just know that I'm trying to be as focused as possible. These are going to be some creative ideas that maybe people haven't heard before, in all honesty, even the ones that are scoring a 5, because I think that it's time that we think differently about CAS. A couple things about CAS at large, and we'll talk more in depth about CAS in general, but there's no CAS police, and CAS needs to be applied into the context in which you work. And we'll talk more about those later. But remember those concepts, because people think the CAS is very prescriptive when really it's not. And we'll get more into that later on. And then the last thing is possibly there'll be some level of determining a plan for applying the standards. I will a few times throughout to answer some questions as we need as well. So
Dan, I'm going to interrupt really quick. A couple times you've paused in
okay.
your presentation, and then it picks back up. So
Okay.
just so you know, if I'll let you know if it continues to happen.
Okay.
Hopefully,
Yeah, I apologize for that. I hope it could be my settings here. Who knows what's happening, but I apologize for that.
no problem. Not it's technology, right? All right. Please continue.
I think that problem's happening. Okay, you back? Okay, sorry about that.
Seems good.
You all froze on me too, so I apologize on that, but going to the next slide here, focusing a little bit more now on CAS in general and what this organization is, what our standards are. CAS has been around for 45 years. This is our 45th anniversary. Founded in 1979, we're currently a consortium of 41 member organizations representing the diverse functions of student services, student affairs, whatever you call it, anywhere from admissions all the way to undergraduate research and all the things in between, campus activities, residence life, etc. We are driven by a real sense of collaboration and consensus building, and we try to arrive at our standards through those practices. We have 52 sets of functional area standards and self-assessment guides, and we have 3 cross-functional frameworks, which I'll explain those later on. Our mission is really to empower professionals to enhance student learning. I'm sorry, this is our vision, but what we want to do ultimately is be seen as a foremost contributor to student learning, development, and success. We are committed to doing that in this vehicle of being a consortium. We are a distinctive organization. We're not a member-based organization other than associations are our members. and associations appoint 1 to 2 individuals in order to represent their interests as we work collectively to create these standards. We are focused on the development, assessment, and improvement of quality programs and services. A little bit about kind of how CAS standards are structured, and that is we have 12 different sections. We start off about the why they exist, what programs and services they serve, what are our outcomes we're aspiring towards, how we'll assess those different program services, those objectives, those outcomes, all the way down to what are the facilities and infrastructure we need in order to enact our program. I do want to remind you of those points I said earlier, that there are no CAS police. CAS is not an accrediting body. We should not be confused with an ABET or anything else. There is no accrediting body for fraternity or for student affairs programs. And what I will say is that whether it is fraternity and sorority life or multicultural affairs or whatever, the programs that you're going to enact can benefit from self-study and self-assessment, but we are not an accrediting body. I also will say that people get really wrapped up in this idea about CAS being implemented in a specific way. The focus of today's session is pretty much entirely to counter that narrative, and that I would hope that you will use these in the way that make the most sense for your institutional context. So whether you're a 4-year, public, private, whatever you are, 2-year, whatever you are, you can use these in ways that make sense for your organization, your unit, your division, et cetera. So we have these 12 sections. All sections have what we refer to as the general standards. Those general standards cut across all 52 sets of standards. So whether you are LGBT programs or admissions, you have comparable standards that you're working towards. Now, those 2 functional areas would have distinctive functional area standards as well. They are only in that functional area, and those are must statements. Whether it be our general standards or our functional area standards, when we refer to something as a must, that is a standard for us. Again, no police, you all can assess to what extent that is important in your context, but we believe through research and literature and common understanding of the fields that we're representing at the CAS table, if you will, that these things are practices that should be enacted for high quality programs and services. In all of our standards also, though, we have what's called guidelines. Those are non-bolded should statements or may statements that really lift up ways that you might contextualize those standards, that you might implement them, maybe some practices that could be recommended versus essential only because of the diversity of context we work in, those kinds of things. And so really what we're saying here is that we have these standards we put forth. There are some that are unique to the functional area. There are some that cut across all the area, but we do try to help the user in navigating their implementation by offering some guidelines as well under all of them. The last thing I'll say relative to CAS at large, we both understand kind of what we are as an organization. Our 52 sets of standards are really helpful in terms of looking at how a program might be enacted. What I will say, though, is that in order to properly assess those functional areas, you would also use our self-assessment guides. And those are helpful kind of templates that you can look at in terms of how to grade, if you will. And again, this is self-study I'm talking about right here. To what extent you are compliant, not compliant, you have insufficient evidence, or it's not applicable. Self-study, internal review, those are driven by internal commitments to ethos. In some cases, you'll have external reviewers come in and also evaluate to what extent their perceptions align with your self-assessment. But these are some of the tools that we provide in order for you to effectively examine how your programs are doing. Julie, are we good in the chat? I'm going to pause here as we talk about wrap up the CAS in general and just see if there's any questions or any problems with the technology.
Yes, so technology's been great. No questions that are coming in the chat, but this is a good reminder for all of our participants that if you do have questions, please drop them into the chat. If we if we have a pause point, we might address them then, or we will save them for the Q&A at the end. So I don't know if we want to wait just a few more seconds in case anybody's typing out a question.
Sure.
Somebody does have a question about the slide deck and the recording will be emailed to all participants probably tomorrow. So at the conclusion of this presentation, so you will have access to all of the resources you'll be seeing here today.
Yeah, and I'm always able to help people. We have lots of resources we can pass along to. So, all right. moving forward, here's what I'm kind of thinking about. This is where my mind is going right now in terms of how CAS can be better used, the CAS standards can be better used in practice of continuous improvement efforts within student services, student affairs. So I know that we're working off of these ideas of having frameworks for assessment. And on the left side of your screen is what is one version about the assessment cycle that many of us operate off of. And I like the fact that over time we've tried to simplify assessment cycles in all honesty. I think that you could have little subparts of all of these four areas, but ultimately, breaking it down into four distinct steps in the process can, I think, really help the user. And so when you're looking at the purpose that you're trying to achieve, your overall mission, what are the outcomes you're trying to move forward? And outcomes could be objectives, it could be goals, et cetera. Then the next step in the process would be to create the interventions that can really make a difference there. You want to gather and interpret the evidence in terms of how those are doing. It might be various forms of assessment. And that's why I don't think everything has to be a methodology. There can be different ways for you to ascertain how people perceive a program went, or even just talking through some of the staff identified challenges or such to that intervention. But that being said, it's important to always examine how you could do something better and then to improve the overall process. I really like on the right side of the screen, and I stole this from the University of Alabama, and I know that as an LSU person, I should probably not use anything from Alabama, but what I will say is that this is an excellent model that they hold up for continuous improvement. And I actually really like their terminology because I think it really speaks to how a non-assessment person might view this model. So they talk about this like tailoring your strategy, being more intentional with how you're going to enact something. Implement. What is it going to be in order to implement that strategy? Analyze the data that comes from that, and then use the idea of enhancement in order to focus on improvements. I really love the word enhancement in all honesty, because I think that improvement implies to some extent that maybe things were deficient, where enhancement to me really focuses on elevating programs and services that might be already operating very well, but could be improved through some simple tweaks, those kinds of things. What else is on my mind is that we have these models of assessment out there. We have these models of continuous improvement that have been adapted by these departments of student affairs assessment across the country. It could be, or you might be in a different office, could be academic assessment, whatever. But we have these ideas about what it should look like to enact continuous improvement. CAS has this recommended approach to looking at our program review, and there's 7 steps that we recommend. It's planning the process, assembling and educating the team for the self-assessment, identifying, collecting, and reviewing that evidence, conducting and interpreting ratings using the SAGs, the self-assessment guides, developing that action plan, preparing the report, and closing the loop. And we've actually, I think we've changed the language on that too. I don't think we use closing the loop anymore, but really that idea of continuous examination of what we know about the delivery of programs and services, how we can improve those moving forward. And there are other sessions of these workshops that I've done. I'm happy to share those resources with folks in terms of implementing specifically program review. That's not the intent of this session. Specifically in the abstract, it did say that this was going to be beyond program review. But I'm happy to share resources relative to this. People always have a lot of questions about this process, particularly for a number of people who might not be using it as much in their practice already, who are kind of exploring how it might look like to infuse CAS more into their work. Another thing that's in my mind right now is how, whether it be through assessment or whatever, there's really a need for us to be more intentional in our application of whatever frameworks we're using. It could be cultural competence, it could be assessment, it could be whatever we're looking at, but we need to be more intentional to enact it in a way that creates efficiencies, effectiveness, those kinds of things. Assessment cycles by nature are relatively intentional. They're structured as such, the steps you might follow, but it's important that we don't just think that we're on one stage and we're not attending to the rest. We need to have intention and purpose around doing it in a way that feels holistic for the users. And that really is about some level of ongoing application and attention. A lot of times in these processes, people conduct them and they cross it off at the checklist. They've done the review, they're done with it. They've looked at the standards, they're done with it. They've done the survey, they're done with it. And so I think that as we're looking at continuous improvement at large, you're not done with things. And that can be a real place of discomfort for folks. but how we use information to improve delivery of services has to be more clear for people, and we have to be more intentional, and we need to focus more on the application and attention towards those goals. Part of it too is to build culture. And what I will say, many people have robust models for program review for their division of student affairs, student services, wherever we're calling ourselves. But what I will say is that that culture may not be strong towards the evidence buildup or the use of the process to make improvements. And I really think that the culture has to be intentional about how we actively use these processes of self-study, of program review to make improvements. And it has to be almost a daily ethos, if you will, that we are going to focus on making improvements based off of the data we have. That data could be small d data or big D data. I'm not talking about like surveying all the time or conducting 100 focus groups. I'm just asking us to examine with the information we have at hand. It could be scaled at 1,000 students. It could be scaled at 1. It could be 1,000 staff across a division. It could be 1. But whatever level of information we have, how are we using that to inform our commitment to improving programs and services? We also need to be really focused on proactively applying and then being responsive to the findings. There's a need to enact self-study and these processes in ways that really are grounded in like purpose and communication and collaboration and all those kinds of things. And then once we get the findings, we need to make sure that we're planning in order to respond to them sufficiently. And I think the last thing that's on my mind right now is this real push to elevating. And I mentioned this before in the cycle there, when you're thinking about, enhancements, there are a number of programs that operate very well on paper. I recently did a program review for an area, a department that really is very strong. Lots of things are really good about it. And what's the next elevation in order to get to that place where we are better documenting our contributions to institutional and divisional priorities, better marketing the contributions we make to student learning, development, and success, et cetera. So I think that to some extent, we're talking about programs that are fine, that are operating well, but how do we elevate those in ways that are really meaningful? And the last thing that's on my mind is really this idea of, in the current environment, if we are not focused on determining what really matters, what really is essential, and how we do that in partnership with each other, I think we're going to be in a world of hurt moving forward. I think we can't keep throwing spaghetti on the wall and hoping it stays there. I think we need to actually be really focused on what are the few things that are functions, what are the few things that programs within those functions, what are the few things that this one isolated interaction should accomplish, and do that really well. And I think that the need to collaborate has never been stronger. Whether it be at a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution, no one has the amount of resources they need to be effective. And the work we're doing is not that students only traverse one aspect of the institution. If a student is in your office and you are the campus activities advisor, there is a good chance that they'll share with you some kind of experience that they've had that's negative, that's over in the academic advising space, or in their classes, or as a result of having to park on campus, et cetera. I mean, students do not isolate their experiences to the singular office that they're looking at and saying, I'm only going to talk about the event I'm planning, in terms of campus activities board. But we need to all work together more collaboratively. And I'm hoping that some of these applications I'll talk about will help us do some of that. So Julie, I'm going to move on to the applications for CAS standards and how this might look in practice. Are there any questions or comments in the chat? Technology still good?
Yep, everything's going well. And I dropped another reminder for people to drop their questions, comments, or ideas in there. But I think they're just too excited to hear what you have to say right now.
Okay. Or they're so bored they're doing something else. Who knows? But we'll see. Again, I'm going to own that I'm in a lot of stuff's been happening lately era. So I hope that my thoughts come across as organized, and I hope that you all, whatever happens today in terms of what I do here, there's other resources I can give you. I'm always available. I'll give you my information at the end in order to have that for you all.
And you're getting some love in the chat saying people are excited.
Oh, good. Great. Thank you. All right. So what are the applications that we can do here? We just talked about some of the things that are on my mind. I just want to tie these two concepts together, and I think I've explained them already. But I think that ultimately, as I explain these applications of the CAS standards, which include but go beyond self-study and program review, I want you to be thinking about how, with the intention to build culture. Because I know there's been lots of conversations, lots of stuff written about culture of assessment, those kind of things. We need a culture of continuous improvement, not just assessment. And so I'm kind of tying these two things together in my thought process. This probably won't be an easy thing to do without the slide right in front of you, but I'm going to have you think, and I'm going to try to articulate as I talk about the 7 or 8 different applications for CAS standards, where they might play in the different processes that we have here. Okay. All right. So applications of our standards. And you'll notice I put down here, measure effectiveness is way down the list. That's probably where you'll find, most of the self-study kind of program review kind of stuff. I'll spend very little time doing that, but I want to talk about the other aspects that really are ways that I've seen CAS effectively used in terms of our standards. So there could be a way to design new or reimagine programs or services. I know if any of you have worked in the campus life space before, you might have a campus life office with 5 different functions underneath you: student organizations, fraternity and sorority life, campus activities, volunteer services, leadership programs. This is one example of a place where there might be a need to pull out a function to create a separate office. Or maybe in a learning center model, right? So you'd have disability services, you'd have tutoring services, you might have academic advising, you might have career services, which might be a model might be seen more prevalent on a 2-year institution, because a lot of times those people are doing multiple hats in terms of all the learning support, advising support, those kinds of things. And so think about how it might be important if you're going to take one of those things out and say, this has grown in such a way that we need its own office. The standards could be a way that you all are framing what that office could be doing and prioritizing. And for me, I think that whether it's new or reimagining, the CAS standards really are a great vehicle for you to look at and say, what are the true priorities we have as a department? Now, let's take this and think about it even more creatively, because I want us to know that doing all 12 sections isn't always the thing. There might be a need to soft launch where every department's looking at section 2, which is programs and services, and they're going to pull out the 5 standards that they want to work on for the next year. So that's one example of creatively applying these standards in ways that could help you design or reimagine programs and services. And so it's important to think about, like, these standards can be a way to pull out standards that could emerge as priorities in a planning process or whatever. Another application would be the idea of learning and development outcomes. CAS has had domains and dimensions of learning within our standards for almost 2 decades. And they were grounded originally in the Learning Reconsidered literature, which in the student affairs world probably was one of the first kind of scaled efforts to implement learning and development in the context of student affairs. There were other documents before that, principles of good practice, those kinds of things, but I do think that people look at Learning Reconsidered as one of the first times where student affairs kind of launch into the learning and development space. So what we have in CAS are our domains and dimensions of learning. And what you might do in terms of creatively thinking about these things is, what I worry a lot about in student affairs world is that our departments try to do too many learning outcomes with too many programs that are cut across all the different things they do. You have a division of, at LSU, I'll use that for example, we have 14 departments. If everyone's doing 4 or 5 different outcomes, how are we ever going to be able to measure that in a way that really creates meaning for our publics? And so what I might say here is that one creative way to use the standards beyond program review and self-study is to identify across each department, what are they distinctively poised to bring forth in terms of learning, development, and success? And if they create the outcome for that, how do we look holistically at our division of student services, whatever we're calling ourselves, and say, here's all the things we're trying to achieve. Once we look at that list, if there are things that are glaringly missing, then maybe we could find ways to add it. But end of the day, if we're saying that these 14 departments at LSU are each looking at these things, and we'll have evidence to show that cutting across all these experiences, students can learn and develop as a result of their experiences, and these are the skills or the attributes are going to be enhanced as a result of that, that's really good. And I think it'll help us prioritize more too. I think part of the pushback on learning and development in the student affairs context over the last decade really has been this idea of you're asking us to do too much that doesn't feel natural to the work we're doing. Now, we can have some conversations around student learning and development as an outcome in the student affairs, student services space. But what I will say is that that's not an unfair response, because I think what we haven't done well is say, well, really, what are the priorities here? What are you distinctively positioned to do in your area? And let's just focus on one or two things versus doing all the things, cutting across all the programs. So I think that one creative way to apply the CAS standards is to have that common language, to clearly map back to the larger divisional priorities, those kinds of things. Also, in terms of the applications for CAS standards, that could be a creative way to use these beyond program review and self-study, is to really evaluate how you spend your time, energy, and allocate resources. And, I think no one thinks they have enough time or resources to do the work we're doing. Students drive that and dictate that agenda so often, and it's fair to be responsive to that. But we can't keep just throwing everything out there and thinking that our staff will be able to maintain their well-being, will be able to really determine priorities, will be able to really effectively serve students if we're not determining what the priorities are and how we're going to allocate time and resources towards that. If we see something in our practice that doesn't line up with what CAS recommends as a general standard for delivery of programs and services, I might suggest we don't do it anymore. And so there's lots of ways that you can look at these standards and say, okay, this is kind of going to be our roadmap for the future. Going back to my first bullet there, here are the 5 or so things we're going to prioritize for the next year. Our time, energy, and resources are going to be allocated there. Yes, we'll be responsive to the environment as we need to be, but end of the day, we're going to prioritize things in ways that achieve these objectives, achieve these outcomes. The fourth application of CAS standards that I think it's important that people think about creatively is how this can enhance staff competence. I think that for many people that go through the process, and I started with a cold open, where basically some of the questions that might be put out there for people, why do we do this process? It takes a lot of time. My job is really demanding as it is. I've heard time and time again that going through the process of actively examining the delivery of programs and services through self-assessment is a really enriching experience for people. You might have to pull them kicking and screaming, but end of the day, they've had an opportunity to explore how the department can be better. And in many cases, it re-energizes them in order to figure out what's their next level of development they need to focus on. You don't need to go through the self-assessment process to do that, though. If you were to say to your staff, okay, this year, a really big commitment we're going to have is collaboration. We're going to focus on creating partnerships across the institution that allow us to better deliver programs and services. Pull out Section 8 standards as a staff, talk about the things that will be the hardest to do and those things that are the lowest hanging fruit to achieve. Maybe the things that are hardest to do are the things that you prioritize professional development around. Engaging your institution's human resources or local resources or reading a book or whatever, but what are the things that you can do in order to enhance skill sets in any of the different sections of the CAS standards? I use collaboration as one because that's very important to me. And I think very few people really have the skill set to do that work that naturally fuses into their work. And so I just use that as an example, but I mean, staff development could be in the area of leadership or human resources or technology, whatever. There's always ways for us to be infusing these standards into a more intentional examination of our current skill set and how we might improve those skills moving forward to better serve students. Measuring effectiveness. I will say around the program review and self-study model, excuse me, sorry. I'm not going to talk about the process of self-study. That is a different workshop. But what I will say is that people should honor their context and their resources and their priorities as they enact that. There is nothing that says you have to do all 12 sections. There is nothing that says that if you cannot achieve a standard that you should, be fired for that. I think that there's a way to look at this process as let's pick the parts that are most helpful for us. Or let's identify the standards. Maybe some of these things are not high priority for us. We're going to just say it's okay. We're not going to do these for this year. Maybe, put those in queue, but look at the self-study in a way that isn't always about evaluating the effectiveness. I mean, it could also be here's how we're going to take this process and just improve moving forward honoring the resources, capacity, the context, those kinds of things. I think for me, the biggest ways to think creatively around using CAS standards, particularly in the area of effectiveness, would be to think creatively about how to best implement self-study and program review that honors the people that are doing it and the outcomes you're trying to achieve. We also have strategic planning, operational planning. I think it's a wonderful idea to take the standards and, especially if you're thinking about launching a program review model and you've got a year or so down the road where you're going to actually implement it, I don't know why we wouldn't. It's almost like teaching to the test, right? I have a 9-year-old and she just took part in the LEAP exam, which is basically like high stakes in terms of how students are learning in the 3rd grade. Well, you have the CAS standards. If you're going to do a program review, you're teaching to the test there. Look at the standards. Start implementing things that you can plan to achieve in order to do well in that process. So I think that whether it's a leading into the process of program review or using the results of that afterwards, just thinking creatively about how you take what you find there and create strategy or create plans for achieving high-level operations. The last 2 bullets here, I think, are some of the things I'm most excited about moving forward, particularly if you do have a self-study and program review model that you're using. Excuse me. I think that when you have all these self-studies done, when you have a culture where people are attending to the CAS standards, when you have this idea that people are looking at continuous improvement as part of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, what are the common challenges that we have in place that we have to tackle? And, so many people that do these program reviews, I wonder if they're looking at all the reports in the aggregate and saying that over time, these are the things that keep coming up, right? And if they keep coming up, what are the expectations we have to reconcile? What are the resources we need to reallocate? What are the strategies we need to do in order to redirect time and energy on those tasks versus maybe some of the other things people are doing? So there's a lot of questions that have to be answered in terms of creatively thinking about how, when challenges emerge, how the evidence you're pulling from the infusion of CAS into your culture can help you drive like ways to address those challenges. And again, so I'll just say collaboration is my foremost value as a student affairs practitioner. I love nothing more than a good collaboration. I think if 2 departments can say, hey, we both have this issue, how can we work more effectively together in order to better use our resources? I just think there's so much energy that can be put towards that would have better outcomes for students. And so those are some of the creative ways that I hope that you can re-envision using the standards beyond just a self-study and program review. I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions, Julie, that I need to answer.
Yes, we
okay,
do have a
go ahead.
question. And
Cool.
again, maybe some more will come in while we're asking this one. So Joseph asked, can you share ways to help design program or unit level learning goals as opposed to event level learning goals?
I'm looking at, hey, Joseph, nice to see you. Thanks for, I know you're a big fan and user of CAS, so thanks for being here today. Let me look at this question again. Again, my mind is cluttered era, but can you share ways to help design program unit level learning goals as opposed to event level? Yeah, I love that question. And what I'm going to say there is that I think this has to go in at the beginning of every year for the operational planning and strategic planning efforts that departments have. And so, for example, I'm thinking my mind goes back to student involvement, campus life programs. That's where I came up through. And when you have all these different entities, whether it be organizations, activities, Greek life, whatever it is you're doing under that umbrella, and they're all doing lots of events, I think sitting down together and saying, what are we collectively most able to contribute to in terms of learning and development? And let's name that. So whether that's, civic engagement or multicultural competence or career preparation, right? And you can take the dimensions, the main domains and dimensions and figure out what language you want to use there. But I think if you were to, as a group, determine what are the 1 or 2 things that we're going to collectively work towards to facilitate learning, and then how do we see those implemented in the events, programs, services, activities, interactions that we have, I think that's a great conversation to have. I'm envisioning this model where you give them a copy of the domains and dimensions. You ask every person to kind of think about what they would uniquely bring, have the team discuss that at the kind of team level, come to consensus on one or two that you're going to do, figure out the high stakes programs, the large scale programs, interactions, services, et cetera, that maybe you'd want to assess with a more capital A assessment, whether it be surveys or focus groups, whatever. Then some of the things you might just want to pull in some more conversational or interactive data, small A assessment, and just prioritize that for the next year. I think event level learning goals are well intended, but I also think that they get lost in this sea of like, how do we actually really demonstrate contribution for typically a small population of people? I'm thinking in my mind about like a concert that student activities does, or like a one-time speaker that student organizations or leadership or Greek life might do. And really, you can't look at that and say that's what's going to make a difference. If you look at one or two learning and development goals, outcomes, and you apply those across all the things you do, and you collect enough information to know that in the aggregate, here's what we're seeing in terms of the overall contributions that we're making to student learning and development within these domains and dimensions, that's where the power is going to be. I hope that I answered that question well. I think that, it's harder, it's a little bit harder in practice because especially as well-intentioned young professionals are enacting some of that at the event level, they want to know what's happening, but not all assessment can be created equal, and certainly not all of it equally demonstrates how you're doing with the CAS standards.
And Joseph in the chat said that that was a very helpful response. I want to follow it up because this might be asking the same question, but it may be a little bit different. So one of the things that I have really enjoyed listening to you talk about is this idea of being mindful of how much work we are trying to engage in based on our bandwidth, because we want to be able to serve our students as completely as possible. But if we as employees are completely overwhelmed, then that's not going to work so well. You talked about sometimes there are areas with too many learning outcomes, they're being asked to do too much, they're trying to identify priorities. You also said maybe somebody who is newer to the CAS standards may look at this 12 and be a little overwhelmed. Where do I start? How do I start? And I think you provided a good model in that last question potentially to apply here. But that was sort of my thought. Like if somebody is new to these CAS standards and want to think about how do we decide where we're going to begin this process so we don't take on too much and we can do it within the bandwidth we have available, how do you recommend addressing that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I have to check myself because I have a little bit of a so here's my take on how younger professionals, new in their work, trying to make sense of life demands and the functions of their job while trying to create relationships with students. I will say that many younger professionals, myself included, when I was younger professional 30, 25 years ago, what I will say is that we're not really good at prioritizing, and we also are not actively engaged in relationships with our supervisor that allow us to have open and honest conversations about what truly is a priority. And so I actually think, Julie, the question is not an assessment question. There's a component of this that's assessment because there's a skill set and a competence level. And I think also in our master's prep programs, particularly if you're coming up through student affairs prep programs, you're taught that assessment is a methodology, not a mindset. And so that's part of the challenge. We'll put that aside for a second. But what I will say is that supervisors have to have ongoing conversations to help supervisees really determine what is the best use of their time. And I know there's a colleague on the chat right now that I worked with while they were an undergraduate student, and I think they know that this was part of my philosophy. Was I was the assistant dean for fraternity sorority life at a campus that had 6,000 students, and for a period of time, I was the only person doing that job. So what I had to say on a weekly basis to the officers and some of the councils was, I have this much time to give you this week. Where's the best place to put my energy? Now, I was only 8 years into my work, but that was still 8 years. I had some practice by that point in order to figure out how to best have those conversations. But particularly younger professionals today are rightfully looking at how these environments we're working in are inequitable and unjust in some ways, but also that the work has to get done. And so what I will say is that having conversations on a weekly basis, especially early on, to help them say, okay, in my 40 hours this week, I am going to spend 6 hours on advising students. I'm going to spend 3 hours on attending staff meetings, like really examining their time, almost like a time audit, if you will. So I don't want to go too much more in depth. I just think the supervisory component is so important. I think the skill set to look at assessment as beyond passing off another survey or a focus group is hugely important as well. Every interaction that a staff member has with a student is small a data, assessment data. And if we start hearing over time, many of us might, if you're a resident director, you might have meetings with all your resident advisors. If you're a director of a multicultural affairs program, maybe you're talking to all the student organization leaders that are kind of housed within your unit. We're hearing common themes here, right? And so if we're not pulling in that information and saying, okay, we need to stop them because obviously what we're doing isn't working, that is an assessment process. That is a continuous improvement process. So there's a skill set that has to happen that you start listening with an assessment mindset in order to facilitate environments that are really committed to continuous improvement. I think that your question, Julie, it could be another whole workshop. I have lots of thoughts on it, obviously. But what I will say is that supervision has to be more intentional, competence has to be elevated, and we have to start thinking about how assessment is more than the methodologies, but more about a mindset that we enact in order to figure out how we can make immediate changes to improve the programs and services that we're working towards.
Thank you very much. And I don't know if you have additional slides you want to get through. One other question did come through. If you want to cover that.
Yeah.
All right. So Shelley asks, can you speak to standards/part 3 related to student learning and development for student affairs functional areas that do not have a role directly serving students?
Yeah, I love that question. We get it a lot because I actually think that whether you directly serve students or not, like I would think that a bursar for whom we have standards is going to have a very different take on student learning, development, and success than would someone that's doing residence life education. So I think that like whether you are directly serving or not, Section 3 can be really hard for people. I'm the kind of person that believes that every interaction with a student, so let me talk about the bursar versus residence life kind of example, and we'll talk about the fact that maybe we're not doing any student interaction. Any interaction with the student can facilitate some level of learning. So for example, in the bursar's world, it would be that they know how to pay their bills, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe not seem like a big learning or development outcome, but certainly it can facilitate student success as they, we want them to persist, those kind of things. So my firm belief is that you can do that in any context. In an environment that you're not interacting with students at all, it is totally fine for you to say Section 3 is not applicable in our context. And in any of the standards, it's okay to say this is not something that works for our context. What I will say too, though, is that, and this goes beyond Shelley's question. So I'll just, let me say that first. I'd say none of the standards are such that if you were to put in a self-study, or if you were to say, as you're trying to infuse this more into your culture, that these things just don't really fit for us, that's okay. You make it work for you, right? But what I will say too, though, is that for sometimes people use that as an excuse to not do the work. So I think that the self-study, the use of the standards, the infusing into the culture is really an opportunity also to examine how some things are not getting done for whatever reasons also. So Shelley, that wasn't your question, but I hope you heard here that like really if it can't fit for you, it just doesn't apply. And that's okay. For some people, it might be the facilities piece because it might be a strictly online institution. So maybe that the programs and services that you're examining do not really tie into Section 12 of the standards. Those kinds of things. I hope that answered the question there for you. Yeah, Darby's point. Darby's like one of the experts in this area as well. I always appreciate her perspective, but she talked in the chat about the student employees there also. That's terrific. Yeah, and that's another thing real quickly too. Learning and development success outcomes don't have to be scaled in such a way where it's like you're only talking about measuring thousands of students. Sometimes the impact you're having is on 1, 2, 3, 5, whatever, and that still matters as well. I do have a few more slides, Julie. I know that you have a couple more things. They're not long slides, but
yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So I'm done the content. It's important that I hope you understand more about it. If you want more information, how do I go? Here we go. Sorry, let me close this out. The closed captioning gets in the way of my little arrows here. Here we go. All right, few resources for you. Many of you might know CAS previously as a published book. We are now only digital, which allows us to put out new versions of our Blue Book every year. The version does not change for our general standards. It changes for specific functional areas. General standards are still revised every 3 to 4 years. So the question we often get is, I'm operating off of a 2010 version. Well, that's not good anymore. I mean, but like, even if you're like looking at the 2024, 2023 version, what's different in 2024 is the infusion of new functional areas. All that to be said is we are putting out a new publication on an annual basis now, and you can access that through our store. Our cross-functional frameworks could be helpful. I talked about the 52 functional area standards, esports, multicultural affairs, collegiate recreation, et cetera. These three cross-functional help us to address a more systemic challenge we're facing: health and well-being, first-year experience, behavioral concerns. Those are resources we provide. A number of resource papers are available as well. The last one I highlighted because I think this is a great new resource we've launched in the last year: how to help grad students and new professionals adjust to using the CAS standards. And if you have any questions, this is my email. I'm happy to provide you with more resources. There's also, if you reach out to me, if you wish to purchase resources, we can provide you with a discount code for SAL members. I want to really elevate this new relationship that CAS and SAL has entered into over the last, I think, I know Renee's on here, so I think it's been about 6 months we've actually been actively enacting that partnership. But what I will say is that we are committed to helping SAL members elevate their continuous improvement practice, their assessment practice, and we believe that CAS is one vehicle that can help you do that. And so we're really excited about the work we're doing together in concert with you all. And I'm also so thrilled at the work that Renee is doing to connect not only CAS and SAL, but the NASPA knowledge community and AALHE and ACTA Commission, and all these entities are coming together to talk about how we can elevate student affairs assessment at large. So I think that's where I'll stop, Julie.
Well, great, thank you. That was one of my last questions, was sort of access to CAS resources. So it sounds like individuals can go to the website and get access. Can you share a little bit more about are there free resources? Is it primarily through these purchase resources? Can somebody become a member of CAS? For those people who might just not know a lot about CAS, I think that would be.
I love those questions. This is really good. Thank you. There are some free resources on there. You have to go through our store to get them because, of course, we want to have your email so we can send you CAS stuff. But there are some terrific resources. We have a grad student resource and a faculty resource that are both free that you can download. Many of our resources are for purchase. I will say that if you are truly invested in infusing CAS into the culture of your division, it could benefit you to subscribing to CAS. And there's one fee that covers 1 year of access to all of our resources, including all of our updated standards. And we probably update 4 to 6 sets of standards on an annual basis. And so it could be beneficial to do that. Our resources range from anything from a resource paper at like $15 or $20 all the way to our subscription model, which is around $900 for everything that's the 1 year. And we don't call it membership, but we call it a subscription to all of our resources. All that stuff is articulated as, I should have put the CAS website up here too, but it's just cas.edu, and you can go to our store and check that out. If you have questions, send me an email. Also, like I said before, I can provide a discount code as a part of our partnership with SAL.
That's fantastic. And I dropped into the chat the link to the Student Affairs page that has the CAS partnership, and then the direct link to CAS. All right, we have just a couple minutes left before I need my 2 minutes for the last bit here. I just want to give our attendees, if you have any last burning questions that you want to ask while we've got Dan here with us. Not only student affairs expert, but obviously a real CAS expert.
Question. If I can't do CAS stuff, I can't do anything at this point in my life. 16 years on the council. If I can talk about CAS for an hour, no matter what era I'm living through, I should not be doing this anymore.
All right. Yes, the question came in, can we share the chat when we share out the other resources? I am not the big boss on this committee, and I'm not sure if that's standard practice. It seems like a reasonable request. I will make sure to pass that along in case there are good things here in the chat that folks want to have access to. All right, and then I see one last question has come in. Let's see. Related to a previous question, we can't assume that students will participate in all of the things or in any sequential order. How do we make sure they fit together regardless and don't rely on a sequential ordering like you might have in a class?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge with assessment of out of the classroom experiences. This is not the answer to the question. I do want to specify too, though, is that to some extent, when you do CAS as a self-study, it's an assessment of the assessment. And so what happens is that the standards are examined in terms of the evidence you have about how those things are conducted. Some of that might be anywhere from surveys or focus groups all the way down to like collateral materials, websites, those kinds of things. And so CAS doesn't really attend to that aspect of it. The standards are not that specific either. They tend to be more on the lines of providing a general breadth of services, those kinds of things. But I do think it's challenging for us to say, and I think we should be careful how we talk about out of classroom experiences as contributing to things like retention, persistence, those kind of things. I think some of the things I would recommend is just that, students have shared with us that they believe these experiences have contributed to their decision to stay or persist or graduate, those kinds of things. So I don't think you can isolate it in any way. I'm babbling a little bit on that one because I think that's a whole different workshop in all honesty. But CAS as a tool would probably not help you do that. CAS would be a way a department looks at the delivery of their programs and services. There is not, Karina, there's not a set of student employment set of standards. I love that you're doing that. It's really important. I think the NACE competencies are a terrific way in order to kind of frame student employment outcomes. I love that. I know we're doing that in our UREC here, our collegiate recreation here. We don't have a set of standards, but there are frameworks for that. And I think that NACE is probably a good way to start, or within your respective functional area. I don't know what functional area you work in, but career services certainly has some of that for you.
So what I'm hearing is some of you have ideas for future presentations. Maybe
Yes.
you don't want to be the presenter, but maybe you know an entity who could, or maybe you would like us to identify the presenter. I am going to drop that link into the chat where you can submit a proposal, or if it's not you wanting to submit the proposal and you just want to share some information with the committee around what types of topics you would like to see, feel free to do that at that link as well. And on that note, we are almost out of our time today. So as we conclude our session, I would like to have us all give Dan one more round of digital or chat applause. If you open your React button and you click really fast, it gets wild. There's colors and lots of things. Seems like that we could all use at the end of our academic year. Some additional love before we head into the busyness of summer. So put it into the chat, do it behind yourself in your little window. That would be great. So thank you very much, Dan, for this wonderful presentation. As I've shared, all of these resources will be emailed out to you and the recording will be available as well. I'd also like to thank our SAL Professional Learning and Development Committee for their work in helping us to bring forward this conversation. We also hope you will join us next month in June for the next structured conversation. It's going to have Tori Rare, Natasha Jankowski, Paul Holliday Millard, and some more friends. And they'll be talking about what's next for assessment, insights from current graduate education practices. That structured conversation will be on Thursday, June 13th, same time as we're used to. Be sure to watch the SAL listserv for that information coming out and sign up to join us then. And on that note, we thank you very much for coming here today, joining us. We wish you a great day and a wonderful summer that is still going to be filled with student affairs assessment.